Welcome to the Embryo Adoption Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Mellinger. On this show, we explore the possibilities embryo adoption offers to families often struggling with infertility, though not always. Through insightful interviews and moving stories, we uncover the blessings of this unique path to parenthood. This podcast is brought to you by the National Embryo Donation Center, giving hope to those longing to grow their families. Now, let's get started.
And we are so glad that you're with us. And before we get started, if this podcast has been helpful to you, don't forget to share, rate, review, and subscribe. That'll spread the word, get those algorithms going, and we so appreciate you doing this. I'm looking forward to this one. Randy and Jenni Paul, one of our embryo adoption families at the NEDC, are with me today, and we're going to start off with the big finish here at the beginning, which is their son, Silas. Silas is about 7 or 8 months old now, and for those of you who are watching the video version, you will be able to see his adorable face at the beginning. So good to see you guys. Thanks for joining us. Before we get to your story, tell us about Silas.
Oh man, he's just so sweet. He's just cutest baby, and yeah, he's just really fun. His personality is really starting to shine, and he's just been a blessing to us, and can't imagine loving any baby more than him.
Randy, what about you?
Yeah, it's been so fun being a dad and just being able to connect with Silas to get to enjoy, moments with them. It's been a sweet journey and cool to see how God has blessed us with this little boy.
Well, he is adorable, and he's been great. We decided to introduce him at the beginning of the podcast. We always play this different ways. Sometimes families want to keep him with them the entire time. Sometimes they're like, he's going to be too restless, so we'll wait to bring him in at the end. This time we're like, let's just do it at the beginning. So they have some help at the house that they're going to hand him off to. He's waving bye-bye for those of you who see the video version.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Sounds good, and so glad that you guys introduced us to him to start the podcast. Well, while Jenni hands him off, I'll start with you, Randy. One thing about this podcast that helps so many people is it shows them that they're not alone, because many of the families, not all, but many of the families that we speak to have had infertility journeys. And there's strength in being heard and knowing that someone else understands. So that's an important part of this. How did you two find out that you were going to have to navigate infertility?
Yeah, again, thanks for having us on. So we have been married for about 6 years now, and initially weren't planning on having kids right away. But about 2 years in, we decided, it was about time to do that. And so we went into it like anyone else, just saying, okay, let's just go ahead and start trying. And then no success for about a year before we started looking at anything else. So we had tried some, ways of being more intentional, some things to try to plan out, to time things better, and still no success. So after about a year, we had gone to one of our local fertility clinics to get tested, just to make sure there wasn't anything big and obvious to be wrong. And after that, there wasn't anything that they could find that was obvious. And so from that point, we started considering, what do we then, now that we know we have infertility to a degree, what do we do from here? And so that was kind of the beginning part of our journey, and led us into a lot of potential options, as most people face, when they're in that moment of like, what do I do next? There's so many options that sometimes it's pretty overwhelming. And so that's kind of where we had to start the journey.
Was it harder? Well, I mean, I guess you don't know. You don't have anything to compare it to, but what's your guess? I mean, looking back on it, would you rather there have been a reason that they could pinpoint, or do you think it was harder having it unexplained?
Yeah, there is some comfort in knowing what is wrong, but I don't know. We just had to come to the point where the Lord is in control of opening and closing the womb. And so in some ways, knowing that there wasn't a problem, it was easier in a way just to trust that God was doing this for a reason, even though it didn't make a lot of sense. Um, so, I mean, I'm glad there is nothing wrong with either of our bodies, you know?
Yeah.
So I guess that kind of always, that was kind of challenging too, because you just never know, oh, maybe this month it'll happen, maybe this month. And after that year point, we decided just to try for another year, and then nothing happened after the second year.
So it's beginning to be a longer road at this point, and as you said, you start looking into options. So take me through that part of it. How did you end up finding Embryo Adoption and the National Embryo Donation Center?
Are you okay if I go for it?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yep.
So at about the year mark, when we had tried for a year, got tested, we had just joined a new church, and two of the members of the church, they were in our discipling group, and they had told us their daughter and her husband had done embryo adoption through the NEDC. So pretty early on, we actually heard about embryo adoption. I had never heard of it. Randy had never heard of it. So it was planted in our minds really early on. But at that time, we did not know anything about reproductive technologies. And I was like, oh, that's cool.
You
But I
you should
also
be
was,
grateful. You don't want to know a lot about that.
yeah, yeah. So, but in my mind at that point, I didn't know anything. But in my mind, I was like, well, that sounds cool. Like embryo adoption sounds really great, but why would I do that when I could just do IVF and have my own children? And so that started a whole journey of learning about the IVF world and everything.
Well, and and like most couples, initially, you want to start off first with like, well, we want to have kids of our own and have to work through that. And so, we actually had tried a couple of rounds of IUI first to see if that would just increase our chances. And both of those were unsuccessful. And we had talked before going into IUI. I was just saying we're going to try that twice. And if that doesn't work either of those two times, then we're going to kind of consider potentially IVF or maybe adoption. But there's still a part of our minds of like we still want to try to have kids on our own. But then when the IUI was not successful, then we were saying, okay, well, what's going to be the next step? And so we actually right around that time we had connections through our church and people we knew. Of two kids that we could have potentially adopted, either one being an infant that was going to be born in the near future, and then another opportunity of about a 3-year-old that the mom was in a difficult situation and we might have had the opportunity to adopt. And so we actually, started that process a little bit of maybe considering, what are the steps to those. And those two options didn't pan out either. And so yeah, we just kind of we're trying to be really prayerful and faithful and like what's the next step. And clearly these things weren't the way that the Lord was kind of leading this. And so again, there's a lot of options out there. But when it came down to though, once it came down to the point of like, okay, now is it IVF or adoption? We were actually really thankful for Albert Mohler because we listened to his podcast every day. And at that time, actually, right, perfectly timed when we were going through this, he had a podcast where he had talked about advanced reproductive technology and the idea of moral risk. And that's something we had never really considered before. And so that was really helpful for us to really sit down and think through this and trying to figure out what option moving forward really carries the least moral risk.
And we love Dr. Moeller. He's a supporter of our organization and has spoken on our behalf, and we're so thankful of that. Can you say more about this topic of moral risk? Because I think that's an important component that Christ followers have to consider when they're in a situation like this, and not everyone does stop to think about it. And that's one thing we as an organization want to stress is you need to stop and think about it.
Yeah, I think we believe, and the Bible supports as well, that life begins at conception, fertilization. And so when we start playing around with that, like taking sperm and egg out of the body, creating life, and what I learned even in my conversations with the fertility doctor and nurses, they gave me a scenario that's pretty typical for their clinic. And they said, okay, if you were to do IVF, usually couples make about 10 embryos. And about 4 of those embryos don't make it to the point of transfer. So when she said that, I was like, okay, if I wanted to do IVF at this clinic, 4 of my biological babies would die even before they had the chance to be implanted in my womb. And at that point, I was like, morally, I don't want to go before God and say that's okay. Like, it didn't sit well with my conscience. And so she had me, like, like say, had me at hello. It was like, when I heard that, I was like, goodbye. So I think that's kind of the moral risk part is we didn't want to create life knowing that it would die. And we also didn't want to create embryos that would be frozen for a long time.
Yeah, and so, obviously, like every decision we make carries a moral risk. There's really no decision that has no moral risk. So it's up to us to really consider what has the higher moral risk and what's lower. And so, in that, embryo adoption is actually the least moral risk because at this point, these embryos have already been made by another couple who have gone through that process, and they're just waiting for the chance for life. And so it's more of a rescue mission to bring the opportunity for those embryos to have the life. So that's what really led us to the embryo adoption route is because, yes, we could have gone through IVF and gone through that process, but we don't know if that would be something that we would be in this position in the future to maybe be in the same boat as some of these donor families of you just don't know if you can, commit to all of them. Even if you go in wanting to, you don't know what that future is going to hold. And some of these families have had that happen to them. And so knowing that there's, over 1 million embryos just frozen in the US waiting for life, we just felt very called to want to be a part of giving those embryos a chance instead of making more and potentially being a part of that other process. So
you put it really well. And am I correct that at some point along the process, you mentioned that there was a family in your church that was grandparents of NEDC babies. At some point in the process, you were able to talk to that couple firsthand, right? Can you tell me what that was like?
Yeah, that was really sweet. So I think we had already signed up, did our application. I think I was taking the injections, the tummy ones at that point. So, but yeah, we got to see this couple with they had twins through the NEDC. And I was just amazed that they just looked like normal parents with normal kids that they loved. And still in my mind, I'm like, I think the hardest thing for me with this whole thing was knowing that whatever children we would maybe get from the embryo adoption was they wouldn't be my biological children. And that was a big barrier that I had to work through. But then seeing like this mom holding her son and he's 10 years old, so it wasn't like a little baby. It was
No,
there's
their kids are old now, right?
yeah,
Old is
so
relative,
like
right? Compared to
yeah,
yours.
so it was just really sweet and that really just seeing that really helped me to be like, okay, I think I could definitely like love and nurture whatever children God decides to give me.
So tell me about the process with the NEDC and what it was like for you.
yeah, we're really thankful. It honestly, so where I was talking about all the other steps we were taking to consider all the other things, they weren't really panning out very well. There were, as some Christians will talk about, a closed door. And so we, once we started the process of deciding, yep, we want to do the application for the NEDC and move forward that way, things had gone actually pretty smooth for us. And so we had actually, because we were considering one of those previous adoptions with the little 3-year-old, we actually had already started a process with a social worker for home study. But we had to stop that process to say things aren't working out. We're just going to put it on hold. Well, a few months later, once we started the process of embryo adoption, we had to, go through and finish and complete that home study. And it was really so sweet. God was very gracious that she actually hadn't gotten rid of any of our paperwork. And so that just made it so much quicker already. And then, we went through the home study, which was so helpful to be able to go through these modules and really process, how do you grieve infertility? You need to be able to grieve that before you can accept another baby into your heart, into your life. And how do you, prepare your heart for that? And so that was really helpful. The NEDC has videos that go into more specific embryo adoption modules that are supposed to help prepare you too. So that was great. And then eventually we got set up to come down for the medical clearing. So, we traveled from here to Tennessee, to Knoxville.
Yeah, we live in Spokane, Washington.
Yeah, so that's a little trip. But we came down and were able to meet with everyone, and it was so sweet to be able to go through you and the embryologist, the nurse, the case manager, Dr. Keenan, everybody, and it was really just such a sweet thing. Once when we were sitting in that room in the fertility clinic down there, it was just such a sweet feeling because it's like you could just tell there was just such a joy and a passion of this group of people to want to really care for the lives of these embryos. And so that was great. We went through, got cleared, and then, worked with the case manager to go through and figure out, okay, what couples are we going to consider in all the donor options, which there's a lot there, but yeah, honestly though, every step of the process was really smooth, and we were just so thankful to have gotten that opportunity.
Take me to the day Silas was born.
Oh, I might cry. It was so good. He just came out and was so perfect. And yeah, just will always be imprinted on my mind. It was so sweet. And we're both crying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just really just like you have your own baby and his journey. Like he was frozen for 9.5 years. And there's so much buildup and anticipation with going through this process, especially going through several years of wanting a baby and not being able to have one. And then it's like all these expectations and desires and prayers were just answered when he was born. And so it was awesome.
Yeah, it was a very sweet moment. We and the sweetness with embryo adoption is you get a bond with that baby through the pregnancy. So, we had those times of being able to feel him move and all that, all through the whole time that you get a bond with them, and then to have that moment, it was so sweet. I will never forget that moment.
And you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but I was just curious, where do you think God has your family building journey going right now?
Well, it's funny you should ask because I am actually pregnant. Yeah.
Tell me the story.
Well, it's not as, exciting in a way as our journey with Silas, but we just conceived naturally this time. Yeah.
Yeah, God is good.
Yeah, so I'm about 14 weeks along, and yeah, this pregnancy has been harder than the one with Silas, but I'm doing well and I'm healthy. But yeah, we just got pregnant.
That is such wonderful news, and I didn't even know that going into this interview. We usually don't go through a lot when we invite couples on here. We just say we're going to talk through your story, and sometimes you get surprised when you talk through the story. Congratulations, already, Randy! You've got to be so excited too.
Absolutely. And it's really sweet because in a few different ways, obviously, but like initially, I tell a lot of people God clearly wanted to start our family with Silas, because again, we talked about the Lord opening and closing the womb. And so, as we've already shared with this whole process of how smooth things went, like it was really clear that God wanted to begin our family with adopting Silas. And we knew from there, who knows what would happen. And but then, this, December was when she started having some symptoms because we had talked in the fall about, family planning and being like, what do we do in the future? And we were like, well, we don't know if we can even conceive naturally still because we had never gotten pregnant before. And so we didn't want to necessarily just hold off and then go through a longer process potentially. So we again just decided just to leave it into the Lord's hands. If He was gonna have it happen, it would happen, and it did pretty soon actually after that. And so God is good, and it's such a gift. Life is such a gift, and so it's sweet to see how now he's building our family this way. And who knows? I mean, we were always open to potentially doing embryo adoption again and all that because it was such a great process. So, um, but it's really sweet. These siblings will be about 13 months apart. They'll be pretty close. So,
That's it. I was just trying to do the math. They're going to be incredibly close.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh man. Well, congratulations. What a wonderful development. And I didn't even know that was coming. So it's a great surprise. Let's wrap it up with a couple of things. And each of you can take one or both of you can take each of them. So I'm wondering, is there anything that about the embryo adoption process that you would want to pass along advice for somebody who's considering going through it? So if you have any helpful takeaways there, I'd love to hear those. And also, I'd love to hear just how this whole experience shaped your faith and your relationship with God.
Hmm. Yeah, advice. I mean, if your heart is to adopt, I think you should just take that step of faith and see if this is what God has for you. Like in our case, we tried adopting two other children and the Lord just said no, but this was very smooth. So if you have a heart for adoption and you want a baby, and there's a big need, there's a lot of embryos that need the chance to continue their life. And so I would just encourage whoever's listening, if you're thinking about it, just take that step and at least contact the NEDC or I know that we're just so grateful that we went through the NEDC. And as far as my my faith, I think even before we decided to do adoption of any kind, God worked on our hearts in a lot of ways. I think for me, probably Randy too, but we had to come to a point where we realized that God wasn't withholding anything good from us because he had already given us his son Jesus Christ. And so that was not an immediate overnight thing, but over time with prayer and God's people in the church, and it was really sweet. And so we had already kind of reached this contentment. And I won't say I walked it out perfectly. There was many times where I was crying and everything. But the Lord has been really faithful to keep reminding me that he's already given me the best thing, which is his son. And so, yeah, I think for me that helped a lot. And then as we actually got to see the fruit of the adoption and seeing Silas born, I was just so grateful for God's wisdom because my plan would have been to get pregnant right away, have my own children. And now we just say every day, like, I can't imagine not having Silas as our son. And so I'm just grateful, like God's God's plans are always way better than than mine. So
Yeah, and the process we've gone through has been such a learning process. Like when we first went through our infertility, we didn't really know a lot about what's going on. Even when it came to IVF and all the ethics and stuff that we're talking about, like that's not something that's really well known initially. It's on the outside is seen as as a positive way of, getting pregnant and having your own family, but there's a lot more underneath. So I would encourage people to really take time to try to understand more about that and really consider some of the ethics and the morals behind it, because it is an important thing, especially for any person to really consider walking through a big decision like this. And so, taking that into consideration, and then as Jenni's already shared, like the importance of being a part of a body of people who can support you. And so, again, as a Christian, having a solid local church, because our church wasn't trying to tell us what to do. They were just in the sense of like what to do with infertility. They were just trying to say, look to Jesus, trust in the Lord, and he will guide your steps. And so it's important that, we try to focus, like Jenni just mentioned, the fact that, our hope, even though the desire for a baby is a good thing, that's not our ultimate hope in life. And our ultimate hope in life and death is being God's and being conformed into the image of his son. And so regardless of where people are at in the process, the call is to look to Jesus and let him guide your steps. And who knows, like I said, we had no idea what those steps would be, but God will a lot of times he will show you his will as you walk it out too. So there is a point to pray about it, to consider those steps, but then take a step like we did, take a step into something, and then he'll guide it from there. And so we were so thankful, and it's been such a sweet journey for us to grow, because now we continue to just trust and see how God is, bringing goodness through all sorts of different circumstances. And we've even grown so much through our infertility. We've seen how even the infertility had a part in his plan to prepare us, because now we're being able to share it with other people, and we try to take opportunities to share about embryo adoption, because it's unfortunately not well known. And so the fertility clinic we went to never put it forth as an option. Even Jenni's OBGYN didn't really even know about it much, the office there. So we try to take opportunities to share it, because again, had not that couple at our church shared it with us, we wouldn't have even known, and who knows, but like God clearly had a plan for that. So we're so thankful. So I just encourage people just to really consider it, because it is so sweet. And like I said, we couldn't imagine our family being any different now. So
Wow, it's an amazing story. Well, you've done such a good job telling it. We're so grateful that you took the time to join us for this. Want to congratulate you on Silas, and congratulate you on his sibling who's coming in a few months. Thanks so much, Randy and Jenni.
thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Embryo Adoption Podcast. I hope you enjoyed learning more about this life-changing option for building a family. Hey, if you or someone you know could benefit from embryo adoption or donation, visit embryodonation.org to get started, or just to find out more. Again, that's embryodonation.org. And don't forget to spread the word, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Join me next time as we continue sharing inspirational stories of the embryo adoption journey. And until then, take care.